Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist with over 14 years of collective experience as a registered social worker and 5 years as a therapist. In this video, I want to talk about aspects of the narcissistic family, particularly with regards to the siblings in this dynamic. Usually within a narcissistic family, there's typically a narcissistic parent, and both parents have a level of narcissism. It could be the case that there's a narcissistic parent and more of a codependent, an enabler. Some families also just have a sibling who is more narcissistic or is a narcissist. I want to talk primarily about the narcissistic family more generally and explain how the siblings, particularly with their gaslighting and their way to question the reality testing of the scapegoat in the family, can be incredibly difficult and hard. And then how you can consider addressing that and coping with that should you be going no contact or at least limiting contact with the family. Narcissists will typically gaslight the scapegoat. According to Sam Vatkin, they don't do that intentionally. Rather, it's their defense of their false self. They will question your reality testing. They're defending their false self. They need to ensure that your truth or how you see reality isn't confirmed by creating self-doubt in the target, in this case, the scapegoat. The narcissist is able to maintain that fragile sense of false self and that fragile sense of self. But then the siblings typically are aligned with the narcissistic parent. And this is why it's more difficult even than the gaslighting that occurs from the narcissistic parent to the scapegoat. But it's even more difficult, I would say, between the sibling and the scapegoat. And so it could be the golden child or some level of an enforcer. One sibling is enforcing the narrative of the superego of the family, and they've had likely the same experience or similar experiences than you growing up, and they at some level they understand the way the parents are or the way that one parent is. Let's say you're having a difficulty with one of the parents and you turn towards your sibling and you explain the challenge, and they might say, yeah, that's true, dad has some anger issues, that's just the way he is, you might as well just get over it. They will in some sense try to erase your memory and your history with the family, in the sense that they likely want to focus only on the positive, and because they've gaslight themselves, and so it's likely the case that their memory's off too, and so they've likely suppressed long ago, and maybe over the years, especially as they got older as adults, they continue to suppress. It's likely the case that maybe their memory is even off, in the sense that they will question your reality testing. This is incredibly difficult for the scapegoat because obviously you had the shared experience with your sibling, and they likely witnessed a lot of these events that went on during childhood, and yet they will play as though these situations didn't happen, or if they did, they'll find a way to justify or rationalize them. And not only that, but they will question your sanity or your reality testing and probably make it sound like you're being overly harsh or not being appreciative for questioning the parent. At the surface level, they'll confirm that they went through that experience, or maybe let's say dad has anger issue or he's an alcoholic. They will likely agree maybe at the surface level with that, but then want to go any deeper typically. So they'll typically keep it very surface level because they've suppressed it in themselves. If you're challenging and wanting to speak the truth to what occurred, it's their own defenses as well, right? Because to them, they've outsourced their reality testing to the parent. And if you're questioning that reality testing, the whole family is put into question, and their identity as a son or a daughter, as a brother and sister, are also put into question. And it's likely the case because it's too painful for them, and it's like having their back against the wall. You're questioning their loyalty to their parent and to the normalcy, which is actually the abnormal normalcy in the family. You're pointing out the truth, but they're seeing you as being the difficult one and questioning their loyalty to their parent and the family. So they'll likely see you, especially if they're the oldest sees themselves as maintaining the siblings and maintaining the family to some degree. With a sibling, it's someone who is usually around your age. Sometimes they can be a bit older or a bit younger, but especially if they're closer in your age, you've had many shared experiences with them. It's likely the case that in the past you guys were close as well. So the sibling, especially the oldest, enforces typically the family as this cohesive unit, And in every family, there's going to be some cohesion and it acts as an emotional unit. But within a dysfunctional narcissistic family, it's all controlled by the narcissistic parent, which has a pathology, a mental model that is broken. The siblings are split from this brokenness, false self that needs to create an all good and all bad. Typically, these roles are assigned as scapegoat and the golden child. And it acts as an organism, whereas within a more healthy family, that family that's more differentiated, there's going to be some independence and so autonomy and communion between allowing the individuals to act separately and have their own individual thoughts and feelings. Within a narcissistic family, there's this malignant normalcy and the sense that they have to all act as one shared unit. Any member of the family that questions the narrative or history is seen as a threat to the equilibrium. You can think about it like a thermostat in a house. So if, let's say, the scapegoat or the truth teller is speaking up about something that the narcissistic parent did, they will see that as you either turning down the thermostat where it's really cold in the house or it's really hot in the house. And interesting enough, though, that they will project onto you. Typically, there can be a lot of coldness in this family in the sense that nothing is really addressed and emotions are shut down. And there can be no communication at times when something is mentioned in the family that threatens this equilibrium. And typically that's going to be blamed on the scapegoat. A lot of times the siblings as well are trauma bonded. And so there's a reaction or an emotion that's discussed. And then the family all reacts as like this shared emotional unit. So when anxiety is expressed, it's not expressed by just one individual, but the entire family feels it. And so it's maybe the case growing up that you had let's say, a narcissistic father who would go into these rages, get quite angry, and the whole house would feel it. Or mom was offended by something and upset, and she would play a victim or go into tears. The whole siblings would be affected, and the narcissistic parent as well as perhaps the father. It's likely the case that some child was scapegoated in that process. It's typically the case when you're talking with a sibling, you're pointing out what's occurring in the family. They gaslight you and say, maybe they speak to the surface of it. They acknowledge to some level that dad has an anger issue or issues with alcohol. But then they typically will minimize it and start to make you question your reality testing because you're basically a threat to the malignant normalcy of the family. And so you're questioning the equilibrium. And they need to ensure that you get into place and that you aren't questioning their reality testing or the family's reality testing. This is the way that the family acts very much like a cult. They might also play on your own insecurities and your own fears, because obviously it embedded in us, and from an evolutionary theory perspective, we don't want to be outcasted, rejected, or ostracized from the tribe. The family is like a tribe, especially if you're younger and you don't have a family to provide needs, support, and resources. It's likely the case that you'll die or go hungry. From a very young age, the importance of ensuring that you maintain your sense as a member in this family, regardless of how dysfunctional it is. But it's likely the case that from a very young age, you didn't necessarily see it as dysfunctional. You suppressed it and rationalized it. And so when, let's say, you're questioning some aspects of the parent, the narcissistic parent, you may be confining a sibling to want support from them, but they will likely argue with you and see you as being difficult and that perhaps you're crazy. So they'll undermine reality and typically delegitimize you in this other siblings, maybe some like a sister-in-law or a brother-in-law, and also to the parents, because typically they're competing, because it's likely the case that in these families that narcissistic parents split the kids, as mentioned. They typically are their first allies to their mother or their father, and they are willing to sacrifice their sibling to get this care and love from their parent. But it's really not care and love, it's just more control and narcissistic supply that they get from the parent. And they'll probably pick up on your insecurities and maybe point out you're going to be lonely or by yourself, or you're crazy and you don't know what you're talking about, or no one will ever love you. Or so they'll use these like very much fear-based and play off of probably some of that evolutionary fear that we all have, those survival needs, to convince you to get in line. For the scapegoat, it's likely the case that they might internalize that from the early on. So they say, maybe I am being difficult, or maybe I'm too much. My siblings are telling me this, my parents are telling me this. Maybe I just need to communicate better. Maybe I need to be less vocal in my criticisms or opposition. It could be over time, as you're an adult, you try to improve. You say, this time I'm not going to raise any concerns. If something's raised, I'll just do my best to let it go and focus on the positive. But it's tricky because within the narcissistic abuse cycle, the narcissistic parents will usually idolize you at the beginning, then they'll devalue you over time. I've mentioned this in other videos. There's maybe a few days where they idolize you, elevate you, and make you see very shine and give you a sense that you're a great person or son or daughter. They'll admire you and give you a lot of praise and idolize you. But then because the narcissist needs to devalue, and this goes into the notion of they're playing out a lot of their inner childhood trauma, they're needing to reject you as your son or daughter in order to test the limits of yourself, and are you going to stick around when you're devalued? And even if you're on your best behavior and doing your best to try to not get into arguments or to have a disagreement with your family, or maybe speak outwardly about some of the truth that you're seeing, regardless of that, it's likely the case that they're going to probably look to get some rise out of you, and so that they can essentially blame you as the scapegoat and say, see, this is the way they are. They'll usually bait you to try to get a rise or to get you triggered in some sorts so that you're dysregulated and looked like the crazy one. And so that way they can probably smear your name and said, did you see what he did in terms of he started yelling at me or he called me names? And there's the notion of reactionary abuse, and likely case because the parent or the parents are perhaps covert. It's typically the case that, at least in the community or the family, friends or siblings, they're seen as the victim and can't do any wrong. So it must be the scapegoat, it must be this difficult child that's stirring the pot. Why can't they just get along and not cause an issue? It's likely the case that they're going to bait you and get a rise out of you to trigger you to get dysregulated so that they can smear your name and make you into the scapegoat. The solution is limited contact or going no contact. You have to ask yourself, would a loving, caring family do that to you? Some people ask if this was like a friend, or let's say that I was adopted or something, would I choose this family to live in? Often the family will say blood is thicker than water and you're not being loyal if you start to question our family. Yet you're probably the most loyal in the family in some sense, right? Because you're willing to give people chances and you want a healthy family that's transparent, communicates, and addresses some of these emotions that are never really addressed or discussed. And that also goes to the superficiality of it. Usually it's very surface level. They might acknowledge that these parents have this issue or the sibling has an issue, but they'll never really address it. So there's always this hostility that's at the surface, and they almost create this hostility so they don't have to look at the deeper matters. But they'll never typically get therapy or any kind of help because, according to the narcissist, they don't need help and they're close to perfect. But again, I just want to go back to the notion of how the sibling and the disagreement you might have with the sibling and how they gaslight you, particularly because you had these shared memories together, is incredibly difficult because it makes you question yourself and have a lot of self-doubt typically, because you were there during these experiences with your family and you knew what happened, and yet it appears and it's likely that the sibling is trying to erase your past. So there's a notion within the book 1984 about who controls the present controls the past, and you can apply that to the family as well. So who is in control in this case is typically the narcissistic parent pulling the strings largely of the siblings, and then the siblings are in competition to get the little attention or supply from the parent. They're willing to throw you under the bus and subjugate you to a certain role to get praise or a closer alliance with the parent. You might also go to the mother or father and said, my brother is saying this about me, or my sister is undermining me and talking behind my back. How can you not see this? It's typically the case the narcissistic parent, yeah, enjoys this and is again needing this splitting to occur because of their infantile defenses. And because they're in the shared fantasy, like this movie, they don't recognize any truth to it. Yet they also are the ones who, behind the scenes, are pretty much navigating the show. But they'll never admit to it and never make it overt. You'll go to them for support. And the case is right. Two siblings do argue, and it could be he said, she said, but they'll always play it like that. That's your brother's just being your brother and your sister's just being your sister. Why don't you guys just get along? That can happen in families. But when one sibling is really undermining you and being very vicious, then that's a completely different category than someone who's just calling you a name or poking at you a bit. And so not only do you not have support from your narcissistic parent, they'll gaslight you and say, this isn't actually occurring between you and your brother or sister. Then your brother and sister will also gaslight you and said, you're crazy or you're being difficult and why don't you just get along and not be so challenging to the status quo. And they'll gaslight you too that your memory's faulty and you actually don't know what you're talking about. They'll also probably stoke certain fears. You're going to be all alone or, no one's going to love you if you keep this up thing. And so they'll attack your character and a personhood. And because you want a family and you don't want to be rejected from the family, it's perhaps the case that you first see the truth, but then if you're in the devalue phase and limit contact for some time, you likely still want to see the best in people and your family and give them another try maybe. Usually the parent or the siblings will be in the hoovering phase and might send a text or find ways to appease the situation. Then you'll go back into the love bombing and idolization phase and the cycle will repeat itself. If you've been through that several times and you feel like you're being on your best behavior and doing all the things you can to navigate this difficulty and not create any drama or call names or have reactionary reactions to the siblings or to the parent, because again, the parent is going to likely devalue you and you're going to the competition is going to continue with the siblings. And it's likely the case that because they want you to put you into the scapegoating role, to some level you don't have control of this because you're dealing with a dysfunction and a malignant normalcy. And because it's usually your body too is going to react to this and your intuition is going to likely telling you something's off. That's why in this video I wanted to talk about the challenge of someone you grew up with, like your sibling, making you question your past. This is very hurtful because they were present during these situations and know the way that the mom and the father are. And yet they're suppress that and they devalue your position and also question your reality. It makes you doubt yourself and can cause a lot of insecurities and your own complex trauma, particularly because it's a sibling, someone that you would think would be supportive. But it's likely the case that from a very young age, this has always been the case. And you've probably went through this at a very rudimentary level from a younger age where the sibling was like this, likely to you, being a bully to you. In these families, the only way to survive is to be a bully. According to them, it's a dog-eat-dog world. They're just doing what normal people do, and this is the way that life works. It's likely the case that you've seen other families that this isn't healthy. Over time, you just get sick of the cycle. You start to pay attention to your body and how it feels when you're interacting with your mom on the phone or you're hearing them talk all about themselves, and then you're drained after that. You're asking yourself, why do I often feel this way after I speak to my family? If it's really toxic, it's going no contact. Then you're dealing with a lot of grief, typically, a lot of anger. But again, it goes to this notion that a family that loves and cares about you would not subject you to this kind of treatment and wouldn't bully you and gaslight you. And that's why it's best to go no contact, to work on your own differentiation. And if you wanted to start a family or if you have a family of your own, then it's doing your best to work on those emotions and maybe those memories and your own inner dialogue, because it could be the case, and likely is that you have interjects from your narcissistic parent, but then also perhaps of a sibling. And let's say it's like an older brother. At times you might hear their voice interject that you've internalized. So it's about mindfulness, right? It's about being aware of these interjects. If it's been a year or two, these interjects are probably going to be to some degree active in you. But then over time, sometimes it's just time, but it's also being mindful of this voice, naming it. Okay, so this is my inner critic, or this is my brother's voice in me, putting me down and making me seem like I'm not a good person. There's some kind of negative interject that you have. And so the first step is to be aware of it, to not listen to it, because cognitive behavior therapy is, so there's usually something in life, let's say you make a mistake, you have this inner voice, this interject that's likely from your either father, your mother, or even maybe your brother or sister. And then you listen to that, and maybe you're not really conscious of it, and then you internalize it and make it part of your identity. So you feel like that's the way you are. So I'm no good, or I am going to be lonely for the rest of my life, or no one's ever going to love me. So there's these limited beliefs that are operating, and they're likely being encouraged or stoked by this interject in yourself. But by becoming mindful, being aware of your trigger, and considering your thoughts and feelings that occur from this interject, you learn to reframe the interject. I think you can't always necessarily stop these interjects from happening. Thoughts happen in you. You do get triggered, but it's by not reacting to the thoughts or feelings and to the interject, by first listening to it, being mindful, and then doing your best to reframe it. So reframing meaning, oh, here's my negative voice, or that sounds like my father. I'm putting myself down again as my dad did when I was younger. I'm not a child anymore, and actually I do a lot of good in my life. It's pulling from your past and your resiliency, and just from the challenges that you've overcome, that you learn to not allow these interjects to overcome you. So if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.